you agree then that we can define good as that which we ought do, or that which ought be permitted, that which we have most reason to do? Does that jive with you?
Yes, I think it. I mean, God, He gives the oath to bees, and He gives them through our conscience, which is in us, and through the commandments in the Bible.
Okay. So didn't I take it? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I would take it then that you would agree that evil would just be what we ought not do, what we have most reason not to do, what ought
Yeah,
not be permitted.
sure. Yeah,
So why?
it is missing the target. It is missing the point, the goal that God has set for us.
Right on. Is God reasonable? Does God reason? Does he use reason when he makes his decision? Does he accord with the rules of inference and logic?
Well, if we can do it, I guess that the one which created us, of course, has much more that capacity, right?
Okay. Would you say that if God is omniscient and omnipotent, then he's also essentially like maximally rational and maximally reasonable as well, correct? Maximally wise, all that stuff.
It's a trap attentional.
Absolutely.
So why does evil exist?
Evil exists because God, He didn't want to create a world of just robots which are pre-programmed to exactly do what He wants us to do. It would be always right us. But He wanted to create free beings which can choose if they want to do right and wrong, because they can also exercise love. And love cannot exist if there is no free will.
So they can
Could it
spend
also be
eternity
God's
living.
nature?
Hold on here.
So they can spend eternity.
So are you saying that it's not possible for there to be a world which possesses rational moral agents who possess free will, and in which none of those agents ever choose to do evil?
I know where you want to go with this, Leo, and the question would be: in heaven, will we have?
No,
free
that's
will
not. That's not where I'm going.
Okay.
I'll say I think it's possible that it's possible that
It's possible to have a
people
world
could-
in which rational moral agents possess free will, and
Yes.
there exists no evil.
yes.
Yeah, I would say it's possible too. I don't see the contradiction. I'm just wondering if Otangelo thinks it's possible.
Well, if Adam and Eve would have chosen not to eat the forbidden fruit, then it could have eventually gone on without being a fallen world, without sin in the world. Right?
So it is possible for there to be a world with rational moral agents who possess free will, and there exists no evil.
Yeah, they would choose only to do good.
So why
They
is
wouldn't have
that
chosen-
not the world which exists?
Well, because Adam and Eve, they didn't choose to obey God.
Yeah, but why would God create a world where they would disobey him? It seems like if
Yeah.
God is going to create a world, if God is like maximally rational, God always does what he has most reason to do. And so it seems that if any form of evil exists, God didn't do what he had most reason to do, because it's entirely possible for there to have been a world where there are rational moral agents who do possess free will, but there is no evil. So then the question is, God has most reason to instantiate that world, so why is that not the world which exists?
I guess he instantiated the world where he knew that evil would come to the world, so he could display his love and his power of redemption and grace.
It's not possible to do that in a world without evil?
Well, then there would be nothing to save, right?
The important
Why
thing
would
was the
something need to be saved?
possibility. The important part was the possibility of being able to do something outside of God's will, right? If no possibility exists for people to do things that are outside of God's will, then everything
But- but yeah,
then
but
this
you've already-
concept of
You've already granted that that there exists a possible world where there are rational moral
Yeah.
agents who possess free will, and yet none of them choose to do evil. So we both agree that the possibility for such a
Right.
world exists. Now I'm asking you, why doesn't it? It seems that if
Because-
God
and
always acts in
Otangelo
accord with
answered it,
reason,
'cause
and
Adam
that's
and
the
Eve
most
didn't choose.
reasonable world, why
It
not
will
though?
exist,
Why
Leo.
would
I
God
think-
have
I think
created a
Leo's
world where
cheating a bit
things
here.
that ought not occur?
Leo's
That
cheating a
seems
bit
like what
here
God
by
is doing
assuming-
is God instantiated a world that he ought not instantiate, and then thereby God does not always act in accord with his reason. So then God is not omniscient. God is not omnipotent.
I think Leo's
So
cheating
God
by
doesn't exist.
assuming his sinful world is the more reasonable one. I don't know why Leo's version would be more reasonable than what we have now.
I don't know what you're talking
Like,
about.
what makes one more reasonable than the other?
What makes one what more reasonable than what?
What is
Yeah,
your
Leo, you want to
hypothetical
say
world
that a world
more
where
reasonable than
sin
what we
would
have
not
now?
have
Okay, I can't hear two
entered?
people talking at once. Orge, what is what more
your
reasonable than
hypothetical
what?
world you just gave? I can't remember the exact phrasing. Where like no one sins or whatever.
Because sin
I
is
would
what
have
we
free
ought
will.
not do. That's why.
Why is that more reasonable than the world we have now?
Because sin is evil, and evil is what we have most reason not to do. Good is what we have most reason to do. So if God always acts in accord with reason, then there's one of two things is true. Either there is no evil, or God does not exist.
But
Evil is
Leo,
what we
God
ought not
had
do.
most
Why would God
reason.
create a world where things ought not to occur? If that's true, then God is not acting in accord with reason. He wouldn't be a maximally reasonable agent.
Leo,
He would lose two of the omnis and he ceases to be God.
where would free will fit in this world? Just strictly out of curiosity.
The fact that it's possible for there to have been a world in which there are rational moral agents who possess
okay,
free
I
will, yet there exists no evil, and we've all agreed such a world is possible. Well, since that's the world where the only things which occur are what ought occur, then and God only does what he ought do, he's maximally reasonable. He only instantiates the world that he has the most reason to instantiate, then that would be it.
And the reason for that is because, well, think about this: if we are, if the world reflects God's nature, and we're both good and evil, we have good and evil natures within us. That stands to reason that God has both good and evil natures, and this is reflected in Scripture. God is described both as light, and He's also described as dwelling in the thick darkness.
Well, God is not,
Okay.
it's only light. He is not evil or sinful or in darkness whatsoever. But to respond to Leo, I think that God brought out a greater good by permitting evil to come into the world by executing his plan of salvation.
Greater
So then
good.
everything that occurs in the world ultimately conduces God's ultimate will and his desire, right?
Yes.
Okay, well then that's just to say that everything that
they had
happens
to
and
eat the
everything
fruit.
that occurs is the best thing to occur. It's what ought occur because it conduces God's will and desires. And then if everything which occurs is what ought to occur, then it's just not evil. So you're conceding that there is no evil in the world. You're conceding there is no possible way to improve the world morally over how it is right now. I just disagree with that.
Okay, Rebecca, can you answer to what I said? I think that, of course, God is against evil, against sin. He doesn't will that we sin, but he did permit the world where sin could enter, because then he could also display his power of redemption and grace and love.
Yeah, so that's the world
But
that
not if
God
they didn't
ought
eat
to
the
have
fruit, right?
instantiated, right? That is the world God ought have instantiated because of the reasons God had for instantiating it. Correct?
If they didn't eat the fruit, then none of that would have. Then there's no evil comes into the world, right? So it had to happen.
God knew that it would happen as soon
That's
as he
the
would
plan.
create the world.
The plan was to bring evil into the world.
Yeah. Why would he permit a world in which
I
there's evil?
explained-
That just seems.
I explained it, Leo, and I explained it
Didn't
twice.
you just
and
appealed to
didn't
free will?
understand
But we
what
both
I
agreed
said.
that it's possible to have a world in which there exists rational agents with free will, yet there exists no evil. And so
Right,
we
if
then
there
come back
would
to the
be
question:
no-
why does that
yes.
world not exist?
Well,
If there
I'm
would
gonna
be no-
I want to answer this now. Look, I'm putting up. Look, this is my cat, Mr. Nice Kitty. Now,
That's kind of
look, I get so much pleasure from my cat. Okay, and so, partially it's because he's cute, but it's also partially because he's so sweet and nice. And you know what? He has options. You know, he could, scratch my face. He could do all kinds of things that are not nice, right? Now, I could, would I make Mr. Nice Kitty conform so that he never had the possibility of, scratching me to pieces? No, I would not make that, because how can I see, it's so wonderful that he has the choice, right, to be mean or be nice. And it's
We
like,
already agreed, though, that there's a possible world, that it's possible to have a world in which there are rational, moral agents
right.
who possess free will, meaning they do have that option, and
Or
yet there still
D-God.
exists
Okay,
no
Leo,
evil.
Then
So, I mean,
maybe
but
we're
you-
talking past each other. Let me explain what I meant when I said yes to that question. Okay? What I meant is it's possible that God created everyone with free will, meaning, and by free will, I mean the ability to choose
Mhm.
whether to do God's will or the choose to do something that is not God's will.
just quick interjectory question. Ought we do God's will?
Yes.
Okay, continue.
Okay. But so God set it up so that we could choose to do his will or not his will. And that necessitates that we have to be able to make that choice. You asked, can it exist that we have free will and a world where nobody does evil? Yes, that is possible. If no human beings chose to do evil, then we would have a world with no evil. We would have a world where all beings are freely choosing to do God's will all the time.
Satan
But
Why don't we
that's
have
not
that
the world
world?
we live in because human
I
beings
know.
don't.
Why
freely
don't
choose.
we live in that world?
Because human beings don't choose it.
Why not?
Rebecca, will
Why
we have
don't?
a-
Well, hold on here. Why don't humans choose it? Why would God create a world with rational
up to
moral
them.
agents?
That's up to
okay,
them.
so God wanted a world where agents could choose that.
Yes.
Okay,
God
so then we
wanted
ought
a
to have a
world where-
world. So then we ought to have a world where agents can choose to go against God, right?
Yes,
Well,
absolutely.
then I don't understand how going against God is evil. The world ought to be that way.
That's the way
It
God
ought to
wanted
be
it.
done. So then there's no evil in the world.
Checkmate.
All right.
And this is why
was a
they
good
call
one.
it the logical
All right,
problem of
Leo,
evil.
that's a good
Either
one.
there's
Okay.
no evil or God doesn't exist. The free will theodicy doesn't get you
Agreed.
out of this.
Okay,
And the
now-
oh Lord, what's the other one? Or the skeptical theism theodicy doesn't get, because if we can grant that there's a world, the free will theodicy doesn't work because we can grant that there's a world where it's logically possible for there to be rational or moral agents who possess free will, and yet there's no evil. And God, acting in accord with his reason, would instantiate such a world. So why doesn't that world exist? Well, because either God doesn't have the power to do it, which would mean he's not omnipotent and he isn't God, or he loses some property and ceases to be godlike, and then the conclusion is that God doesn't exist. Or people will say, well, God permits these evils because ultimately everything, they conduce to some greater good. They allow for some greater good to happen. Well, then that's just to say that that previous evil ought to have occurred because it conduces some greater good, in which case if it's what ought to have occurred, if it was the best thing to have occurred, then it's just not an evil action. And then there's just no evil in the world.